Well, good day. We are going to have a look at Romans chapter 3 tonight, whatever time it is in your part of the world. And we have done chapters 1 and 2, and now we're on chapter 3. So let me read it to you. Then what advantage has the Jew, or what is the value of circumcision? Much in every way. To begin with, the Jews were entrusted with the oracles of God. What if some were unfaithful? Does their faithlessness nullify the faithfulness of God? By no means. Let God be true, though everyone were a liar, as it is written, that you may be justified in your words and prevail when you are judged. But if our unrighteousness serves to show the righteousness of God, what shall we say? That God is unrighteous to inflict wrath on us? I speak in a human way. By no means. For then, how can God judge the world? But if through my lie God's truth abounds to his glory. Why am I still being condemned as a sinner? And why not do evil that good may come, as some people slanderously charge us with, saying their condemnation is just? What then? Are we Jews any better off? No, not at all, for we have already charged all that both Jews and Greeks are under sin, and it is written, none is righteous, no, not one. No one understands or seeks for God. All have turned aside. Together they have become worthless. No one does good, not even one. Their throat is an open grave. They use their tongues to deceive. The venom of asps is under their lips. Their mouths are full of curses and bitterness. Their feet are swift to shed blood. In their paths are ruin and misery. And the way of peace they have not known. There is no fear of God before their eyes. Now we know that whatever the law says, it speaks to those who are under the law, so that every mouth may be stopped and the whole world may be held accountable for God. For by the works of law no human being will be justified in his sight, since through the law comes the knowledge of sin. But now the righteousness of God has been manifest apart from the law, although the law and the prophets bear witness to it, the righteousness of God through faith in Jesus Christ for all who believe. For there is no distinction, for all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God, and are justified by his grace as a gift, through the redemption that is in Christ Jesus, whom God put forward as a propitiation by his blood to be received by faith. This was to show God's righteousness, because in his divine forbearance he has passed over former sins. It was to show his righteousness at the present time, so that he might be just and the justifier of the one who has faith in Jesus. Then what becomes of our boasting? It is excluded. By what kind of law? By the law of works? No, but the law of faith. For we hold that one is justified by faith apart from works of the law. Or is God the God of the Jews only? Is he not the God of Gentiles also? Yes, of Gentiles also, since God is one, who will justify the uncircumcised, who will justify the circumcised by faith, and the uncircumcised through faith. Do then we overthrow the law by this faith? By no means. On the contrary, we uphold the law. So that is kind of very confusing scriptures, eh? When you read that, even just reading the English, it seems a little confusing. So let's just pull that chapter apart. And we have to read, obviously, chapter 3 on the following on from chapters 1 and 2, because Paul is starting to craft and create his message to these Roman Christians, and he's laying down this foundation. And in Romans chapter 3, he's pulling everything together that he's been building on the first two chapters. And he's also removing every possible place where humanity might try to stand before God in their own righteousness. In chapter 1, he exposed the conditions of the Gentile world and its downward spiral that comes when they suppress the truth and reject God. And then in chapter 2, he turned to the Jew that dismantled the confidence that they had in the law, in circumcision, and the outward identity with their covenant that they had. And then in chapter 3, we see him bringing these two groups together and showing that all humanity stands equally under sin. He begins by saying, what advantage is it to be Jewish? And what value is there in the circumcision? He says there's no value in circumcision because the Jews were entrusted with the oracles of God, meaning they were given the revelation and covenant of God, words of God, but he immediately addresses the reality that human unfaithfulness does not cancel out God's faithfulness. God remains true even when humanity fails. So Paul is showing that the real problem has never been on God's promises or God's righteousness, but with humanity's inability to walk faithfully before him. And then he addresses this argument that if human unrighteousness somehow highlights the righteousness of God, does that make God unjust for bringing judgment? And he rejects that idea completely. He will not allow people to twist God's grace. And don't we do that? We hear this talked about greasy grace, and all those people are just going to continue to sin because grace will cover their sin. Paul is rejecting that teaching right here in this chapter 3. And he's not allowing people to twist grace or God's faithfulness as an excuse to carry on sinning. And once again, he keeps bringing it back to the fact that God is righteous and humanity is accountable for what they do. And then he comes to a major turning point and says, are the Jews any better off than the Gentiles? His conclusion and his answer to that is no, because we're all under sin. And then he starts to draw some of these Old Testament scriptures to show that the problem is universal. He says none are righteous, not even one, none who truly seeks after God, none who do good. He describes humanity's speech, actions, and ways as corrupt. He shows that sin affects the whole person, and when the whole of humanity's condition. And it's not saying that every human is as evil as they possibly could be, but he's showing that sin has touched everyone, and nobody can stand righteous before God based on their own merit. And then he starts to explain the purpose of the law. He says the law speaks so that every mouth may be stopped and the whole world stands accountable before God. And he says that the law brings with it a knowledge of sin, for the law reveals the problem, it exposes sin, it removes the boasting that we can have, and it doesn't produce righteousness in fallen humanity. That reminds me of back in Exodus, where prior to the law being given at Sinai, the people that came out of Egypt were grumbling and complaining and numerous times, and God provided everything that they asked for. But after the law, once the law came, the response from God was a different response. And then we come to the center of this passage, and perhaps it's a center or a key aspect to the whole book of Romans. And Paul says, but now, I think that is in chapter 21, but now, after laying out sin and failure and man's inability, he says, but now the righteousness of God has been revealed apart from the law. And although the law and the prophets are bearing witness to it, God is not saying that he's abandoned his previous purposes, but that righteousness is being revealed through its fulfillment is through Jesus Christ. He explains that righteousness comes through faith in Jesus to all that believe, because we've all sinned and we've all fallen short of the glory of God. And Paul presents Jesus as the one to whom God deals with sin, and while still remaining righteous himself, God is both just and the justifier, and of the one who has faith in Jesus. And then he says, where can our boasting be? And it's completely excluded. It's because of this justification that we can't boast. We can't boast about anything because God is the one that has made us righteous. And he says at the end of the chapter, whether faith then overthrows the law, like do we throw the law out? And he says, no, faith establishes the law. In other words, the law reaches its proper purpose and fulfillment in what God has now accomplished through Christ. So if we pull all that together, Paul is showing that humanity stands under sin and that nobody can achieve righteousness through law, through their effort, or through covenant identity. The law exposes sin, but it cannot rescue people from it. God's faithfulness in all this remains constant, even when humanity fails time and time again. Justification is given freely by grace, and any chance of boasting is removed for both the Jew and the Gentile. And we're all brought to the same way of salvation through faith. So there's a movement going on in this chapter. Again, we've got Paul, as he writes, and the way that he writes, he starts to lay out his ideas, and then he hits the central point, and then he explains the idea further. So he talks about how Jewish privilege and God's faithfulness. Then he talks about universal sinfulness. And then he talks about how the law exposes sin. And then the central hinge, which I just mentioned earlier, is that God's righteousness is revealed through Christ. But now the righteousness of God has been manifest apart from the law. And then he reinforces what he's saying, that the faith in what God has done replaces boasting in the law, and both Jew and Gentile are unified through that faith, and that faith establishes the law. So where have we gone for this now? We've gone through 3 chapters in the book of Romans, and I said earlier, I think I said it on the first chapter, that the whole book of Romans has got a theme to it, and the first 3 chapters Paul is writing are talking about humanity under sin, wrath, failure, Jews and Gentiles both accountable. So that is this kind of overall summary of what's going on in these first 3 chapters. Chapter 1 began with humanity rejecting the revelation of God through creation and descending into idolatry. Remember, we talked about that, ungodliness and righteousness, and Paul showing that downward spiral whenever the creator is exchanged for creation.